She was his fated mate. He rejected her in front of every alpha in the realm, publicly, deliberately, without hesitation. And the moment he spoke those words, he didn't just break a bond. He lit a fuse. 7 years later, the woman he condemned as cursed has returned, not as a broken girl begging for redemption, but as a queen commanding armies he cannot match. Drop a like if you're ready to watch him fall to his knees. Comment your city below. I want to know where you're watching from when this empire burns. The sacred moon rite began at dusk, the way it always had, with fire. Torches mounted along the outer walls of Thornvale Keep threw orange columns of light across the courtyard stones, and the smoke from ceremonial braziers hung heavy in the cold night air, bitter with pine resin and dried wolf sage. Every alpha in the Eastern Realm had ridden to this gathering. Some brought war banners, some brought heirs. All of them brought hunger, the particular kind that showed up whenever power was publicly displayed and formally rearranged. Seraphine Ashcroft had ridden in 3 hours before sundown with a single escort, a modest gray mare, and a chest of pressed formal clothes she'd spent 4 months' wages acquiring. She wasn't born to courts the way some of the noble daughters had been. Her blood ran true. The Ashcroft line was old, older than half the territories represented tonight, but old blood without land or coin behind it bought exactly as much as it looked like it did. She'd checked her dress twice in the polished steel mirror bolted to the inside of her borrowed chamber door. Dark blue. Simple at the collar. Not a gown that demanded attention, but one that held its own without apologizing for it. She'd pinned her hair back the way her mother had taught her, tight at the temples, loose at the nape, a single bone clasp at the crown. She told herself she wasn't nervous. She repeated it twice more until it almost became true. The ceremony ground stretched in a wide stone oval between the main keep and the eastern tower, ringed by raised viewing platforms where pack representatives stood in formation. Somewhere in the crowd, 30-odd alpha leaders were watching the rite unfold with the professional assessment of men who measured everything against advantage. Seraphine could feel their attention as a pressure at her back. Not hostile, not warm, simply calculating. She stood in the approach corridor with the 7 other candidates presented by their respective bloodlines. She didn't know most of them. The girl directly ahead of her was from the Caldwell pack. Full lips painted crimson, wrists dripping with estate jewelry. She'd glanced at Seraphine's plain clasp once and looked away without comment. That look had said everything that needed saying. Seraphine tucked it down below her ribs, where she kept everything she couldn't afford to react to. There was a whole architecture of quiet storage built up in there, accumulated over a lifetime of being the Ashcroft girl who showed up to things she hadn't quite been invited to. The official called their names in order. She was third from last. She walked out onto the stone oval and felt the cold snap of night air hit her face like an open hand. The torches to either side made her shadow stretch long across the pale flagstone. At the far end of the approach, on a raised platform flanked by the kingdom's senior wardens, Alpha King Darius Thornvale stood. She had seen his likeness on sealed correspondence and on the carved stone face above the main gate. Neither had prepared her for the physical reality of the man, the width of his shoulders in formal black armor, the way he occupied space with the particular stillness of someone who has never once needed to fill a room with noise. He was 31, she knew. He had held the throne since 22. He had never lost a war. His face was hard the way granite was hard. Not brutality exactly, but an absolute refusal to yield to weather. Dark eyes, heavy jaw, a scar along the left side of his neck that the formal collar only partially concealed. He watched each candidate approach with the expression of a man completing a task he had been told was necessary. When his gaze landed on Seraphine, she felt it physically. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't recognition. It was something older than either. The deep instinctual pull of a mate bond announcing itself to both parties simultaneously, a sensation like the first shock of cold water, clarifying and merciless. She saw it cross his face for exactly 1 second, the slight arrest of his breathing, the fractional narrowing of his eyes. And then, nothing. His expression closed back down like a door being shut from the inside, and whatever had flickered through his features vanished behind the formal stone of his public face. She stopped at the marked position 3 feet from the platform edge and held her chin level the way she'd practiced. The Rite Master's voice carried clean and flat across the ceremonial oval. By blood declared and bond confirmed, does the Alpha King recognize his fated mate among those presented this night? Silence. The torches crackled. Somewhere on the upper platform, someone coughed once and fell quiet. Darius Thornvale held her gaze for a long moment, long enough that Seraphine felt something in her chest begin to unfurl. Cautious, tentative. The beginning of a thing she hadn't let herself name until just this moment. I do not. 2 words, flat as stone, delivered with the same register a man might use to decline a contract. She heard the murmur run through the crowd like a wave across shallow water. Surprise, confusion, and underneath both, the sharp undercurrent of political recalculation. She stood very still. She did not look away from him. She wasn't sure she could have moved, even if she'd wanted to. He turned to the Rite Master. I further invoke the clause of bloodline incompatibility. And that was when the ground fell out. The Rite Master's composure cracked visibly. An elderly man who had presided over 30 such ceremonies, breaking his professional neutrality for the first time she had ever seen recorded. Alpha King, I must advise, the clause requires formal... I have the documentation. Darius extended his left hand, and the warden at his elbow placed a rolled scroll into it without hesitation. He handed it down to the Rite Master without unrolling it himself, as if the contents were already fully known to him and required no further confirmation. The Ashcroft bloodline carries the curse notation from the conclave of the Third Compact. Any bond formed through that line risks corruption of the ruling seat. Seraphine heard her name in his words before he used it. She heard it the way you heard a door being locked. Seraphine Ashcroft's lineage has been reviewed by the royal archivists and found to be an incompatible match for the throne of Thornvale. He finally looked at her again. The bond is refused. The rite is concluded. She stood there, 3 feet from a platform she would never stand on, in front of 30 alpha leaders who were all, every single one, watching her face with the concentrated attention of predators gauging how badly a creature was wounded. She did not cry. She could feel the press of it behind her eyes, that hot, nauseating swell, and she refused it with everything she had. Not here, not with these eyes on her, not for him. She held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned and walked back the way she'd come. She heard the official proceedings resume behind her. She heard the murmur of the crowd begin to reorganize itself around this new political reality. She heard, just barely, the Caldwell girl ahead of her exhale a long, quiet breath that might have been relief. She walked through the corridor and out into the back service yard, and she sat down on a mounting block beside a water trough, and she pressed both hands flat against her knees and breathed. Just breathed. The horse in the adjacent stall snuffled at its hay. A torch guttered in a wind she couldn't feel from where she sat. She had known, theoretically, that rejection was possible. She had not known, could not have understood without experiencing it, that it would feel like this. Like a limb removed. Like a room in her chest that had only just been unlocked, only to have the door slammed shut and sealed. She sat on that mounting block for 11 minutes. She counted them. Then she stood up, smoothed her dress with both palms, and went to find her escort. She had 2 days until she was expected back in Ashcroft territory. She would make the most of the road. She was still 3 miles outside the capital's eastern wall when the convoy was attacked. It happened between the 2nd and 3rd mile markers on the Thornvale to Eastern Road, where the tree line pressed in close on both sides, and the torchlight from the keep walls was no longer visible at your back. 3 wagons ahead of her mounted escort erupted in blue-white flame simultaneously. The kind of coordinated detonation that didn't happen by accident, that spoke of weeks of preparation and inside knowledge of the convoy route. Her horse shied hard left. Her escort drew weapons. She had exactly 2 seconds to register that the attackers were already on both sides of the road before one of them threw a percussion charge directly beneath the front hooves of her mare. The blast threw her sideways from the saddle. She hit the road stones with her left shoulder and her hip, and the impact drove the air entirely from her lungs. The world went sideways and orange and full of noise. She could hear shouting in 2 directions, the scream of horses, the flat crack of weapons discharging. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't stand. She rolled onto her back and stared up at a sky gone orange-silver with reflected fire and tried to find the bottom of her own chest. Someone grabbed her arm. She fought them. Her escort's voice, Garrett, 23 years old, had been riding with her family for 4 years, came through the roaring in her ears. Lady Ashcroft, Lady Ashcroft, we have to move. We have to move right now. I can't. She still didn't have air. I can't breathe. You're breathing. You're breathing. You just can't feel it yet. Come on. He had her by the arm and was pulling, and she was either going to stand up or she was going to be dragged. So she found something that might have been her feet, and she used them. They ran. The tree line swallowed them. Behind her, the road kept burning. She would later understand, much later, with the clarity that only distance and time and a complete reorganization of everything she thought she knew about her circumstances could provide, that she had made a specific decision in those first 50 yards of running, not consciously, not with deliberate thought, but somewhere in the space between the blast and the darkness of the tree line, some fundamental operating mechanism in her had shifted. She was not going back. To the road, yes. To the Capitol, eventually, to collect whatever formal acknowledgement of the night's events needed to be filed. But to the life she had walked into that keep expecting, to the possibility she had spent 3 months' wages dressing herself to present, she was not going back. Because here was the thing that nobody in that torchlit oval had considered when they watched her walk away. She had survived the first thing that was supposed to break her. And the chest she'd built for keeping difficult things in, the quiet internal architecture of 23 years of being underestimated, had a great deal of remaining capacity. They moved through the trees for 40 minutes before Garrett found high ground and assessed. The convoy was gone. 3 of her 6 escort were unaccounted for. She had a bruised shoulder, a torn sleeve, a laceration along her left temple that had bled considerably more than its severity warranted. She had no horse, no chest of clothes, and no documentation beyond what she carried in the inside pocket of her dress. Her bloodline papers, folded small, tucked next to a letter from her mother she'd brought for no practical reason she could name. "We need to get to the road marker at Asheville Crossing," Garrett said. He was kneeling beside her with a strip of cloth he'd cut from his own jacket sleeve, pressing it against the cut on her temple. His hands were steadier than his voice. "I can reach the contact there. Get us horses. Get word to your family." Seraphine was looking out through the tree line at the distant glow of the road still burning. "How many men for a coordinated strike like that?" Garrett hesitated. 8 minimum, probably 12. 3 simultaneous ignition points. Yes. Advanced knowledge of the route. Another pause. Someone inside the convoy planning, or someone with access to it. She pressed the cloth against her own temple to free his hands, and it happened tonight, after the rite. He said nothing. He didn't need to. She turned away from the burning road. "Then we go to Asheville, and we don't use my name when we get there." 3 days later, a formal announcement from Thornvale Keep informed the territories that Lady Seraphine Ashcroft had perished in an unfortunate roadside attack following the conclusion of the sacred moon rite. The kingdom offered condolences to the Ashcroft family. A brief notation acknowledged that the attack remained under investigation. The investigation concluded 11 weeks later with no confirmed suspects. Seraphine Ashcroft read the announcement in a borrowed room above a tanner's workshop in a village so far into the Eastern Territories that it didn't appear on the standard imperial maps. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the same pocket with her mother's letter and her bloodline papers, and she sat for a long time in the gray morning light coming through the single window. She had been building something here for 3 months. A name. Mira Vance. Unremarkable, provincial, forgettable. A story. A merchant's widow from a collapsed border town, looking for trade work. A working knowledge of every clan elder within a 4-day ride, acquired through the particular intelligence of someone who had spent a lifetime being overlooked and had learned to use that invisibility the way other people used weapons. The Eastern Territories were not, as the imperial maps suggested, simply empty space between Thornvale's southeastern border and the ocean. They were a complex web of smaller wolf clans that had been deliberately excluded from imperial recognition for generations. Pushed out, bargained down, stripped of formal standing until they existed outside the political structure entirely. Forgotten was the polite word for it. Discarded was more accurate. She'd been watching them the way her father had taught her to watch chess pieces, not for what they were doing, but for what they would do if the board changed. And what she was beginning to understand, with the careful accumulating logic of a mind that had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing stopping it from thinking clearly, was that the board was going to change. The announcement declared her dead. That was, she decided, the single most useful thing Darius Thornvale had ever done for her. She placed the folded paper in the cold center of the small stove in the corner of the room. She watched it catch. Then she turned back to the scratched wooden table where her maps were spread, and she got to work. That was the moment, not the rejection, not the road, not the burning convoy, that a queen was made. Not from destiny, not from a bond or a bloodline notation or a prophecy either forged or true. From decision. From the specific, unsentimental choice to convert loss into material, to take the thing that had been designed to end her and use it instead as the first stone in a foundation. She would be thorough, she would be patient, and she would be absolutely certain that when she was finished, no one in any territory would ever be able to look at what she'd built and call it cursed. 7 years was enough time to build an empire, if you never stopped moving. The Eastern territories operated on relationship first, law second, and abstract authority dead last. Seraphine, Mira Vance in those early years, learned this in the first season by watching a clan elder refuse a perfectly reasonable trade arrangement with a traveling merchant from the Imperial South. Not because the terms were bad, but because the merchant had opened the conversation by citing Imperial trade code rather than sitting down and accepting tea first. 30 years of Imperial dismissal had produced a culture that had refined the distinction between respect and performance of respect to an art form. They knew exactly when they were being managed. She stopped managing. She sat down for the tea. She stayed for the meals. She slept in the communal lodge in the Eastern Heron Territory for 2 weeks before she said a single word about trade or alliance or the quiet war she was constructing in the spaces between conversations. She learned the names of the children first. She learned which elders had been waiting 20 years for someone to ask their opinion on a specific border dispute, and she let them explain it fully before she offered any thought of her own. It was slow. It was sometimes maddening. She was not by nature a patient person, and there were nights in borrowed rooms and bedrolls in the field where she lay awake with the physical pressure of urgency pressing against the inside of her sternum, and she had to be deliberate about releasing it, breath by breath, the way you walked a horse that wanted to run. She let it run in her head. She let herself see, in exact detail, what she was building. The Silver Dominion, though she didn't yet have that name for it, let herself feel the weight of it, the scale, and then she put it away and went back to being patient. She acquired land through the 3rd year, a modest holding in the southeastern Heron Territory, deeded to Mira Vance through a trade arrangement with an elder who had decided she was trustworthy enough to be considered part of the clan fabric. It was the first territory that formally acknowledged her as a resident rather than a visitor. 2 months later, she brokered the Heron-Callaway Agreement. The Heron and Callaway clans had been in an active border dispute for 11 years. Livestock theft, water rights, 3 violent incidents that had stopped short of open war only because neither clan had enough resources to sustain one. The Imperial administration had declined to mediate 7 times on the grounds that neither territory held formal recognition status. She sat the elders down separately first, not together, separately, over the course of 4 months, building the specific picture of what the other party actually wanted, as opposed to what they said they wanted, which in both cases was less about the border and more about being seen to hold their ground after a decade of incremental loss. She then wrote the agreement terms herself in plain working language, stripped of the legal formalism that both clans had learned to distrust, and she presented it to them at a joint meeting she'd called on the neutral ground of a shared river bend that both territories used for seasonal fishing. It took 6 hours. It was concluded over a communal fire and the kind of meal that happens when 2 groups of people who have been enemies for a decade discover that they are, in certain specific practical ways, better served by cooperation. She sat at the outer edge of the gathering and let the agreement breathe without her name on top of it. Afterward, the Heron Elder, a woman in her 60s named Voss, who had seen more territory politics than Seraphine had lived years, sought her out at the riverbank. "You're not a merchant's widow," Voss said. "Not an accusation, a statement of fact." "No," Seraphine said. "What are you?" She looked at the water for a moment. The fire from the gathering behind them put warm light on the current. "Someone who needs 2 years to answer that question properly." Voss looked at her with the specific assessment of a woman who had spent decades in rooms full of people trying to obscure what they were. 2 years, she repeated. "I'll remember that." By the 4th year, Seraphine had brokered 6 agreements, acquired 3 holdings, and was referred to by the Eastern clans in collective conversation as the Silver Negotiator, a name she hadn't chosen and wouldn't have chosen, but which had the advantage of being attached to a reputation rather than a bloodline, and which therefore couldn't be discredited by a forged scroll. By the 5th year, the Caldecroft clan, the largest of the Eastern territories, with a standing force of 800, a well-established trade network, and a history of refusing to align with anything, sent an elder delegation to her land holding with a formal request for conversation. She served them tea first. She let them explain their position without interruption. When the elder finished, she said, "What you want is recognition. What we want," the delegation head said, "is sovereignty." "Same thing, and I can give it to you. Not from above, not granted, not permitted. Earned, built. Yours because of what you bring to it, and not what someone else decides you deserve." She leaned forward, both elbows on the table, and she didn't dress the next part in diplomatic language. "But I need you to decide if you want a chair at a table worth sitting at, or if you'd rather stay outside waiting for an empire that has never once looked east to invite you in." The delegation conferred for 3 hours. Then they came back and asked what the terms were. She had the terms already written. She had written them 2 years earlier, when she'd first identified the Caldecroft as the keystone of everything she was building. She gave them the document and watched the delegation head read through it twice with the concentrated expression of someone checking for the catch. "No tribute structure," the head said. "No tribute. Contribution. There's a distinction. And the Silver Dominion name? Belongs to everyone who builds it." She met the elder's eyes. "That's not a selling point. That's the actual architecture." It was the Caldecroft Agreement that changed the pace of everything. Word traveled the Eastern territories with the specific speed that only news of tectonic political shifts can achieve, fast and in every direction at once. Within 8 months, 11 additional clan territories had sent formal requests. Within a year, she was holding quarterly councils that looked, to anyone watching from a sufficient distance, remarkably like the operations of an organized state. She began to formally construct the Silver Dominion in the 5th year. Not as a rebel territory in opposition to the Thornvale Empire, that framing would have invited a military response she wasn't yet equipped to answer, but as a cooperative governance structure in the eastern lands that Thornvale had never bothered to claim. She was meticulous about the legal geography. She built on ground that no imperial charter had ever formally registered. She documented every agreement, every trade arrangement, every council resolution and records that could withstand scrutiny from any archival system in the realm. In the 6th year, the first imperial trade envoy appeared at the Silver Dominion's main council seat. He was young, official, carrying credentials from the Thornvale Administrative Chamber that referred to the Eastern Territories as loosely affiliated independent clans. He had clearly been briefed on the Silver Negotiator as a regional facilitator and had not been informed that she had spent the last 6 years turning that informal title into the authority to speak for 43 clan territories with a combined standing force of 11,000. She received him in the main council chamber with her senior advisors present, Voss at her left, the Caldecroft head at her right, a table of 12 that represented more defensive capacity than the imperial envoy's entire escort division. She let him complete his formal introduction. She let him explain the Empire's interest in establishing trade protocols with the Eastern Independent Territories. She waited until he'd finished, and then she set down her tea and said, "The Silver Dominion is not a collection of independent territories. It's a sovereign nation. Your trade protocols will need to reflect that. I'll have my council draft the relevant framework. The envoy blinked. The Silver Dominion is not recognized by Thornvale? Not yet. She held his gaze. But you're here because your Alpha King needs Eastern grain supply before winter, because the border territories have been underproducing for 2 years due to the dispute in the Central Highlands, and because the only reliable agricultural surplus in the Eastern realm right now belongs to my territories. She picked up her tea again. So we can discuss recognition terms, or you can go back and explain to the throne that the Silver Dominion declined to negotiate. He went back. He returned 3 weeks later with a different authorization and a more senior diplomatic title. She spent 2 months on the trade agreement. When it was finalized, it contained in the third appendix the first formal Thornvale acknowledgement of the Silver Dominion as a sovereign administrative entity. She had her archivist file a copy in the Dominion records under the seal of Queen Seraphine Vance of the Silver Dominion. The name was new, the title was earned. The seal was made of iron, not gold, because iron was what the Eastern territories had worked with, and iron was what had built everything she now commanded. She did not think about Darius Thornvale when she signed it. She had not thought about him in any personal capacity for 4 years, which she considered one of her more significant achievements. She was 30 years old. She commanded 43 territories, 11,000 standing forces, the most reliable grain surplus in the Eastern realm, and a trade network that 3 of the major noble houses had become quietly dependent on. She had built it without his recognition, without his protection, without the bond he had refused in front of 30 alpha leaders on a cold stone oval with torches burning. She had built it on the specific understanding that survival was not a passive condition, that it required daily, deliberate, systematic construction, the same way a fortress was built, stone by stone, with intention given to each joint and each load-bearing wall and each sightline from which a threat might eventually be visible. In the 7th year, the threat became visible. It arrived in the form of Garrett, her old escort, who had spent 4 years in the Imperial military and 2 years quietly feeding her information about the internal stability of the Thornvale court. He rode into the Silver Dominion's administrative seat in the high summer and asked for a private meeting, and she gave it to him because Garrett had never once wasted her time. He set a single sheet of decoded intelligence on her table. She read it without expression. He waited. "The Riven Pact," she said. 7 noble houses. They've been coordinating for at least 3 years, possibly more. The archival records I accessed only go back that far, but the operational sophistication suggests longer. He pointed to the second paragraph. They have territorial governors in the Northwest, Northeast, and Central Highland districts. They control 2 of the 3 main supply lines for the Imperial military, and they have standing arrangements with 2 border kingdoms that would give them entry points for external force if the internal move failed. She looked up from the document. This is what collapsed Darius's position. He doesn't know it yet, or he's been told a managed version. Garrett sat back in the chair with the expression of a man who had spent 2 years building toward this conversation and was choosing his words carefully. The same people who forged the bloodline prophecy against you. The same document that was presented at the rite. She was very still. Outside the window, the council yard was busy with the ordinary traffic of a functioning administrative center. She could hear voices, the creak of cartwheels, a child calling for someone across the courtyard. "You have confirmation of the forgery?" "I have the archivist who was coerced into producing it. He's been living with it for 7 years. He's ready to testify." She put the document flat on the table and looked at it without touching it. She had not thought about the prophecy in years, had set it aside with everything else that night, had decided early that the question of whether the forged document had been the cause of the rejection or merely the excuse for it was one she couldn't afford to spend energy on. What mattered was what she'd built, not what she'd been refused. But this was different. This was not about the rejection. This was about a coordinated conspiracy that had used her as a test case and had spent the 7 intervening years positioning to dismantle the only empire in the realm with enough structural integrity to hold the territories together. If the Riven Pact succeeded, if Thornvale fractured from within while 2 border kingdoms moved through the external entry points, the cascade would not stop at the imperial border. It would move east, into her territories, into the 43 clans who had spent 7 years building something worth protecting. She pulled the document back toward herself. Tell me everything you know about their timeline. Garrett leaned forward. That's the second thing I came to tell you. He met her eyes. They've called a summit, ostensibly a peace conference. Every alpha leader in the realm, neutral ground at Meridian Crossing. Darius accepted because he thinks it's an opportunity to rebuild diplomatic standing after the Highland dispute. He paused. It's a trap, and they've sent a formal invitation to the Silver Dominion. The silence in the room stretched long enough that Garrett shifted in his chair. She'll need to attend, he said carefully. Whoever goes, I'll go, Seraphine said. Her voice was flat and quiet and certain. I'll go as Queen Seraphine Vance of the Silver Dominion. She looked out the window at the courtyard, at the territory she'd built, at the thing that had been made from the stone of a night she wasn't supposed to survive. And I'll carry everything I know into that room. She turned back to face him. Begin preparing the delegation. Full formal representation. I want every senior advisor present. She stood. And Garrett. She picked up the intelligence document and folded it with careful precision, the way she had once folded an announcement of her own death. Bring the archivist. We'll need his testimony on record before we get to Meridian Crossing. She paused at the door, looked back at him with eyes that held 7 years of very quiet work and not 1 ounce of the thing that had pressed behind them on a cold stone oval in another life. It's time, she said, for the realm to meet its queen. She left the room, and the door she closed behind her was not the same door that had been shut on her at Thornvale Keep 7 years before, because that one had been locked from the outside, and this one was hers. 3 weeks later, an imperial courier arrived at the Silver Dominion's administrative seat, carrying the formal summit invitation on Thornvale's seal. Standard diplomatic language, routing information for the Meridian Crossing venue, a guest list that ran to 2 pages of alpha names and territorial designations. Her name was not on it. Queen Seraphine Vance of the Silver Dominion appeared in the final section under the heading of non-imperial sovereign entities in the smaller diplomatic text reserved for acknowledged but not formally recognized states. She noted the font size. She noted the placement. She noted exactly how much it resembled the expression on the Caldwell girl's face when she'd looked at the plain bone clasp in Seraphine's hair all those years ago. She called her archivist in. Draft our acceptance, she said. Full formal register. Queen's seal. She handed him the invitation. And add a footnote at the bottom of the acceptance document, in the same font size they used for our listing. What should it say? She thought for a moment. Outside, the summer wind was moving through the eastern territories she'd built from nothing, carrying the smell of the grain fields that were keeping half the imperial north alive this season. Say that the Silver Dominion looks forward to full diplomatic engagement at the summit. She sat down at her desk. And that the Queen of the Silver Dominion has certain materials relevant to the realm's current situation that she believes all parties would benefit from reviewing. He wrote it down. Anything else? She was already looking at the next document on her desk, the edge of her mind already moving through what waited at Meridian Crossing. The conspiracy that needed dismantling, the archivist testimony that would need to be introduced at precisely the right moment, the alpha leaders who needed to see her not as a regional governor managing a peripheral trade network, but as a queen who had been running a sovereign nation while they were looking elsewhere. And Darius Thornvale, the man who had stood on a raised platform in formal black armor and spoken 2 words that had redirected the entire trajectory of her life. She would see him at Meridian Crossing. She had known that since the moment Garrett put the intelligence document on her table. She had assessed it with the same calm she brought to everything she'd built. Not warmth, not cold, simply precise. Whatever he had believed 7 years ago, whatever he believed now, whatever he intended to do when he looked across the summit table and found the dead woman standing across from him in a queen's formal colors, that was his to navigate. She had a conspiracy to dismantle and an empire to protect. No, she told the archivist, that will do. But in the corridor outside, the courier from Thornvale Keep was still waiting for a verbal confirmation. He was young, and he had been traveling for 8 days, and when he'd been briefed on the Silver Dominion by his imperial handlers, no one had mentioned that the queen was not what he was expecting. He was still trying to organize his impression of her into the categories he'd arrived with when one of the Dominion staff passed him with a tray of water and said, without breaking stride, "The Queen will have her acceptance to you within the hour. You're welcome to eat in the hall." The courier accepted the direction. He sat in the Silver Dominion's dining hall and ate a meal that was, he would note in his travel report, considerably better than anything the Imperial Administrative Outposts served. Around him, the ordinary complex motion of a functioning sovereign state moved with the particular confidence of an institution that had not recently required permission from anyone. He filed his report 6 days later back in Thornvale. He noted the quality of the hall, the caliber of the administrative staff, the response time on the formal acceptance. He noted specifically that the Queen of the Silver Dominion had a way of looking at a room as though she had already finished calculating it. He left that part out of the verbal briefing he gave to the senior courtiers, because it seemed like the kind of observation that would be dismissed. But he kept it in the written version, at the bottom, where the people who actually read the details would find it. He did not know, when he handed that report to the Thornvale administrative clerk, that it would reach the senior court advisor's desk the same morning that Darius Thornvale received an intelligence briefing on the Riven Pack conspiracy, the first full briefing, not the managed version. He did not know that the Alpha King would read both documents back-to-back in the space of a single morning, and that somewhere in that sequence, something in his carefully maintained certainty would develop, for the first time in 7 years, a crack. He did not know any of that. What he knew was that the Silver Dominion's formal acceptance of the summit invitation was already on the road back to Meridian Crossing, sealed in iron. And in a chamber in the Silver Dominion's administrative seat, a queen with 7 years of built capacity and a testimony she'd been holding in reserve was reviewing the summit's guest list and noting, in precise clinical detail, the specific positions each noble conspirator would occupy in the room. She had one more thing to do before Meridian Crossing. She opened the correspondence she'd been holding for 2 weeks, the sealed message from the archivist who had forged the prophecy under coercion, the man who had been carrying a specific weight for 7 years and was finally ready to set it down. She read his full account carefully. Read it twice. Then she wrote back to him in the plain direct language she used for everything that mattered, told him what she needed from him at the summit, told him that his testimony would be protected and his account would be part of the public record. She told him one more thing at the end of the letter. She wasn't sure she would have said it 3 years ago. But she was 30 years old, and she had built an empire, and she had the specific perspective that came from converting 7 years of rage and grief and cold clarity into something that was going to outlast every person in the room at Meridian Crossing. She told him that what had been done to him was not acceptable, and that she intended to make that formally, publicly, permanently clear. Then she sealed the letter, put it in the dispatch pouch, looked out the window at the Eastern Territories one more time. The grain fields were gold in the late summer light. The council yard below was full of the ordinary complex motion of 43 clan territories functioning as one sovereign body. 11,000 standing forces, the most reliable supply network in the realm, a reputation that had been built without a bond, without a bloodline notation, without the recognition of any empire. She had been declared dead at 23. She was going to walk into Meridian Crossing at 30 and introduce herself to the realm. And somewhere in the Thornvale court, a senior advisor had just placed 2 documents on the Alpha King's desk, one about a conspiracy that had been running for a decade, and one about a queen who had built a nation in the territories he had never bothered to look at. Darius Thornvale read the Silver Dominion report. He read the section about the queen's manner of assessment. He read the name. He sat very still for a long time. Then he picked up the report and read the name again, and something that had been sealed for 7 years opened without warning in the center of his chest. Not warmth, not hope, not anything he had the right to call by a kind name. Just the specific, devastating recognition of a man who had just understood exactly what he had done. Darius Thornvale did not sleep that night. He sat at the long table in his private study with the 2 documents in front of him and a fire burning low in the grate, and he did not move for a long time. The senior advisor had left 3 hours ago. The household staff had learned across 9 years of his reign that there was a specific quality to his stillness that meant do not knock and do not enter, and they respected it with the precision of people who understood that some silences were structural. He read the Silver Dominion intelligence report a third time. The name was still there. Queen Seraphine Vance. He knew enough about Eastern territorial naming conventions to understand what Vance meant. It was a working name, a functional identity, the kind of designation that people in the border territories adopted when they were starting over from nothing and didn't want their origins to precede them. He knew enough about the Ashcroft bloodline to know that the bone structure of the report, the patient accumulation of alliances, the legal precision of every agreement, the meticulous avoidance of any framing that could be characterized as rebellion, was not the work of a stranger. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose and held them there. The ribbon-packed report sat beside it. 7 noble houses. A decade of coordinated positioning. The forged prophecy. The document he had accepted, reviewed, and acted upon 7 years ago, with the particular confidence of a man who had been shown evidence by people he trusted and had not once stopped to question whether the trust itself had been engineered. He was 38 years old. He had held this throne for 16 years. He had not, in those 16 years, made many errors that he could not eventually trace back to a recoverable position. He was good at assessment. He was good at recognizing when he'd been outmaneuvered and recalibrating before the damage compounded. He was looking at the specific exception to that pattern now. The fire dropped another increment. He didn't feed it. He had rejected her. Publicly, formally, with the full ceremonial weight of the sacred moonlight behind him, in front of every alpha leader in the realm. He had invoked the bloodline incompatibility clause on the basis of a document that had been produced by a coerced archivist under the direction of the same noble coalition that was currently positioning to take his throne. He had then failed to adequately protect the convoy that was carrying her home, and the subsequent investigation had produced nothing because the investigating office had been staffed by men who reported to 2 of the 7 houses now named in the Riven Pact. She had survived. She had erased herself. She had gone into the Eastern Territories, the lands his administration had formally designated as empty space, and she had spent 7 years building a sovereign nation that his trade network now depended on. He sat with the full weight of that sequence. He did not flinch away from any of it. That was the one discipline he had never let himself abandon, the capacity to look at what he had actually done, not the version of it that was easier to hold. What he had done was catastrophic, and she was coming to Meridian Crossing. He pulled the second page of the intelligence report toward him and read the courier's addendum at the bottom. The formal language, the administrative detail, and then the final line that the courier had almost left out, that the Queen of the Silver Dominion had a way of looking at a room as though she had already finished calculating it. He recognized that. He hadn't known he would recognize it from a courier's field note, but he did. He stood up from the table, walked to the window. The Thornvale Capitol was dark and quiet below him, the way capitals were quiet at 3 in the morning. Not peaceful, exactly, but temporarily still, the way a machine was still between operations. He had a conspiracy inside his walls. He had a summit in 3 weeks. He had a woman he had publicly destroyed walking into that summit as a sovereign equal with evidence he suspected was going to rewrite the entire public record of the night she'd disappeared. And he had absolutely no standing, political, diplomatic, or otherwise, to walk into that room and treat her as anything other than what she had made herself. He turned back from the window, went to his desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of correspondence paper. He wrote 3 lines, stopped, read them, destroyed the sheet. He wrote 2 lines, stopped, destroyed that one as well. He sat for a long time. Then he put the paper away and went back to the intelligence report, because there was work to do before he had any right to think about what he was going to say to her, and he had learned, too late, at catastrophic cost, but learned nonetheless, that thinking before acting was not a weakness in a man who held a throne. It was the only thing that kept you from burning everything you were supposed to protect. The Silver Dominion delegation arrived at Meridian Crossing on the second day of the summit's formal opening week. 12 riders in the Dominion's working gray and silver, no ceremonial banners, no advance heralds. They rode in through the eastern gate at mid-morning, while the majority of the assembled delegates were occupied with the formal opening proceedings in the main hall, and they went directly to the Eastern residential wing that had been assigned to the non-imperial sovereign entities. Seraphine had chosen the timing deliberately. She did not want a staged arrival. She did not want the processional attention that a grand entrance would generate before she was ready to use it. What she wanted was to be present, settled, and operating before anyone had finished deciding what category to put her in. She walked the meridian crossing administrative corridors with Voss at her left and her senior strategic advisor Callum at her right, and she observed everything with the flat systematic attention she brought to any new operational environment. The building was old, pre-imperial construction, all heavy stone and deep-set windows that had been built to survive siege rather than impress guests. The corridors were wide enough for 6 abreast. The sight lines from the main hall entrance to the eastern corridor junction were clear for 40 feet in both directions. She noted the placement of the Thornvale security personnel. She noted which positions were staffed by men who moved with military precision and which positions were staffed by men who moved with the slightly off-tempo quality of people who had been placed there by someone other than the head of security. She counted 4 of the second type within the first 20 minutes. "The pact has people in the building already," she said quietly to Callum. "I counted 3, he said. 4. The one at the East Corridor Junction is theirs. Watch his eye contact with the Thornvale guard captain. They're not communicating." Callum looked, said nothing, filed it. Their rooms were adequate, stone walls, heavy curtains, good locks. She walked the perimeter of the Eastern residential wing herself before she unpacked anything, checking side angles and exit points with the thorough lack of self-consciousness of someone who had been doing this for years and had long since stopped finding it excessive. Voss watched her from the doorway of the main suite with the expression she'd worn since the first year, steady, assessing, unimpressed by performance, and attentive to substance. "He's here," Voss said. Not a question. "Arrived yesterday." Seraphine checked the window latch. "Full Thornvale delegation, senior court advisors, 2 of whom I'm reasonably certain are pact adjacent." "And the Alpha King himself?" She turned from the window. "Yes." Voss was quiet for a moment. "You've been preparing for this summit for 3 weeks. You've prepared for the conspiracy, the testimony, the diplomatic positioning." A pause. "Have you prepared for him?" "He's a variable I've accounted for." "That's not what I asked." Seraphine held her senior advisor's gaze for a beat. Voss had been with her for 6 years. She had earned the right to ask questions that nobody else in the delegation would have tried. "I know what I'm walking into that hall for," Seraphine said, "and it isn't him." It wasn't a denial. It was a statement of operational priority, which was a different thing, and Voss was perceptive enough to hear the distinction without pressing it further. The first formal session was scheduled for the following morning. She was seated, delegation arranged behind her, when the Thornvale contingent entered. She did not look up from the document she was reviewing. She heard the shift in the room's atmosphere the way you heard a change in wind direction, not with any single sense, but with the full accumulated intelligence of a body that had spent 7 years learning to read environments before they declared themselves. She heard him, not his voice, just his presence, the particular quality of attention that the room reorganized itself around when he entered, the way 30 assembled delegates and their advisors subtly recalibrated their posture without being aware they were doing it. She finished the sentence she was reading. Then she looked up. He was at the far end of the main table, taking his position with the measured deliberateness of a man who was managing something significant and keeping it entirely off his face. Dark formal dress. The scar on his neck above the collar. Older than the man she'd stood across from 7 years ago in ways that weren't entirely physical. Something in the set of his jaw that suggested the weight of the intervening years had not been light, had in fact been exactly as heavy as they'd looked from the outside. His eyes found her before he sat down. She held it. 3 seconds, flat, neutral, the same look she gave any other delegate at the table. Then she looked back down at her document. She heard his chair move. She heard him sit. Her heart rate was exactly what it should be. She checked it deliberately, the way she checked everything. Not with alarm, simply with the professional interest of someone monitoring an operational variable. Steady. Not unaffected. Steady. There was a distinction, She'd spent 7 years learning it. The session opened with the formal introductions: names, territories, stated interests. When the Rite Master's equivalent, a summit convener, a neutral elder from the Western Territories, reached the Silver Dominion's position in the listing, he used the diminished font size category language from the invitation. Seraphine said, Queen Seraphine Vance, Silver Dominion, 43 member territories, 11,000 standing forces, Sovereign Eastern Administrative Authority. She said it without inflection, the same register she'd used to tell the trade envoy 2 years ago that his protocols would need to reflect her sovereignty. Not aggressive, simply precise. For the record, the convener noted it. Several delegates exchanged glances. She watched the pact-adjacent advisor to Darius's left write something on his document. Across the table, she was aware of Darius watching her, not the 3-second flat assessment she'd given him, something longer, something with more weight behind it that she declined to examine in a formal session with 27 other pairs of eyes in the room. The morning session covered the war threat from the border kingdoms, the supposed reason for the summit. She listened to 7 territorial representatives describe the same tactical problem from 7 different angles of self-interest, and she mapped the pact's influence in real time through the specific shape of which proposals the pact-adjacent delegates actively supported and which they subtly steered away from resolution. They were not trying to solve the border crisis, they were using it as cover. She had known that from Garrett's intelligence, but watching it operate in the room was different. It had the specific texture of a well-practiced performance, smooth enough that 3 of the genuine alpha leaders in the room appeared to be actually deliberating rather than being managed. During the midday recess, she moved through the corridor toward the eastern wing and found, at the junction she'd identified that morning, that the Pact Place security man had been replaced by a Thornvale guard with correct eye contact and proper positioning. Someone in the Thornvale hierarchy had done a security sweep between the morning session and the recess. She filed that. It was consistent with someone in the Thornvale command structure who knew what they were looking for, or had been told to look. She was 3 steps from the eastern wing door when a voice said, "Queen Vance." She stopped, turned. Darius Thornvale was alone. His 2 advisors had continued down the main corridor without him, which meant he had let them go, which meant this was deliberate. He stood 8 feet from her in the corridor with the afternoon light from the deep-set windows cutting across one side of his face, and he looked like a man who had prepared exactly what he was going to say and had simultaneously understood that none of it was going to be sufficient. "Alpha King," she said. He took 1 step toward her, stopped. "I need to speak with you. We're both speaking in formal session tomorrow morning." She held her ground without moving toward him or away. "That's the appropriate venue." "Not about the summit." His voice was lower. Not a whisper. A register that was under control but under pressure, the way a load-bearing wall sounded when the weight above it shifted. "About what I know." She looked at him. 7 years of distance, of construction, of deliberate conversion of one life into another. And here was the specific thing that none of it had entirely armored her against. Not the bond. Not the old ache of it, which had faded with the same gradual reliability that every wound faded when you stopped touching it. Something simpler and more complicated than that. The fact that he was standing in front of her and he was real, and 7 years of operating at remove from that reality had not changed the reality itself. She let none of that into her face. "Then say it," she said, quickly. He held her gaze. "The prophecy was forged. I have the archivist's full deposition. My intelligence division recovered it 2 weeks ago." A beat. "I know what was done. I know what I did on the basis of what was done." He stopped. Started again. The particular texture of a man editing himself in real time to stay within the limits of what he had the right to say. "I know that I have no standing here. I know that." He looked at her with something in his eyes that she recognized the shape of without wanting to. Not as the bond, not as anything she owed him, but as the specific expression of a person who has understood an irreversible thing and is carrying it without looking away from it. "I needed you to know that I know." The corridor was empty. Somewhere in the building, the midday recess traffic moved through other hallways. She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "What you know doesn't change what I'm here to do." "No," he said. It doesn't. The conspiracy extends into your own court. Two of your senior advisors are packed adjacent. Your security apparatus has been compromised at placement level. She watched his jaw tighten. You swept the corridor junction this morning, which means you know at least some of it. More than some. His voice was flat now, professional, the layer below the personal thing he'd just attempted. I've been running a counterintelligence operation for 6 weeks. I have 4 confirmed pact members inside the court and 7 probable. Then you need what I have, she said. The archivist's testimony, combined with my counsel's documentation of the pact's eastern operations, constitutes a complete evidential record. She looked at him directly. Not for you, for the summit, for the assembled alpha leaders who are currently being managed into positions that serve the pact's consolidation timeline. I know. He held her gaze. That's why I need to ask you to present it jointly. She was still. A joint presentation carries more weight than either of us alone, he said. Thornvale intelligence plus Silver Dominion documentation plus the archivist's testimony. It closes every exit the pact has built into the summit structure. One of them goes independently, and they can be characterized as self-interested. Both of us together, they can't dismiss it. He was right. She had been planning a unilateral presentation because a unilateral presentation was clean. It required nothing from him and gave him nothing in return and kept the operational lines exactly where she'd drawn them. But he was right, and she was not in the habit of refusing correct analysis because the source was inconvenient. A joint presentation is not an alliance, she said. I'm not asking for an alliance. He didn't look away. I'm asking you to let me be useful. The corridor was very quiet. She understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent 7 years converting emotion into architecture, exactly what it had cost him to phrase it that way. Not let me help. Let me be useful. The specific language of a man who was trying to be precise about what he was and was not claiming. She looked at him for a long moment, not the flat neutral assessment from the session room. Something more direct than that, an honest look, because he had given her an honest request, and she was not in the habit of responding to honesty with performance. Bring your documentation to the Eastern Wing tonight, she said. My counsel will review it against ours. We present tomorrow morning, second session, and we present the full record. She held his gaze. If anything in your documentation conflicts with the archivist's testimony, we resolve it before we go into that room. Agreed. And we are clear, she said, that this is a strategic cooperation for the protection of the realm's stability, nothing more. We are clear, he said. She turned, walked to the Eastern Wing door, put her hand on the handle. Seraphine. She stopped. He had not called her that. Not her name, not the name she'd had before Vance, not the name that belonged to the woman he'd stood across from on a cold stone oval. He had not used it until this moment, in an empty corridor, in the quiet voice of someone who understood they were using something that wasn't theirs to use anymore. She did not turn around. She waited. I'm sorry, he said. I know that doesn't... He stopped. I know what it doesn't do. She held the door handle. She felt, in the center of her chest, the specific weight of a thing that had been waiting 7 years to be said, and that could not, now that it had been said, be put back. Not because it changed anything, because it was real, and real things had weight regardless of whether you made use of them. She opened the door. Eastern Wing, tonight. Her voice was steady. Don't be late. She walked through, let the door close behind her. She stood in the eastern corridor for one breath. 2. The solid stone walls of a pre-imperial building that had been constructed to survive siege, and somewhere on the other side of the door, the man who had spoken 2 words 7 years ago that had redirected the entire trajectory of her life was standing in a corridor understanding something he was about to spend the rest of his reign carrying. She breathed out, felt the weight land and settle and resolve into its proper position in the internal architecture she had built for exactly this. For the moment when the past and the present occupied the same corridor and you had to choose again what you were building toward. She walked to her rooms, sat down at the desk where her counsel's documentation was spread in careful order, picked up the next document in the sequence. There was work to do. But when Voss knocked an hour later and asked how the recess had gone, Seraphine looked up from the document with the particular expression her senior advisor had learned to read over 6 years. Not closed, not open, but the face of someone who had just absorbed something significant and was integrating it without letting it alter the direction she was already moving. "He's bringing his intelligence documentation tonight," Seraphine said. "We present jointly tomorrow." Voss was quiet for a beat. "And?" "And nothing." She looked back down at the document. "Set an additional chair at the council table. We'll have company." Voss set the chair. And in the hall outside the eastern wing, the summit moved toward its second day with the particular momentum of a situation that had reached the last point before which nothing could be reversed. The moment in which every player had finally declared what they were holding, and the only question remaining was who understood the board well enough to use it. Tomorrow morning, in formal session, before 30 alpha leaders and the weight of the entire realm's political future, one of them was going to show their full hand. The pact was counting on it being theirs. They had not accounted for what happened when two people who had everything to lose decided, separately and for entirely different reasons, that the cost of losing was no longer acceptable. The corridor junction at the eastern wing was manned when Darius arrived that evening with his documentation under his arm and two of his most trusted intelligence officers at his back, by a silver Dominion guard who checked his identification with the professional thoroughness of someone who had been instructed not to wave anyone through on the basis of title alone. He submitted to the check without comment. The guard stepped aside. He walked through the door into the eastern wing. And somewhere in the Meridian Crossing building, in the rooms assigned to 7 houses that had spent a decade constructing what they believed was an unassailable position, the Riven Pact made its final preparations for a summit they were certain they controlled. They had not yet received the information they needed most, that the dead woman they had used as their test case 7 years ago had just agreed to walk into tomorrow's session carrying everything. Darius arrived at the eastern wing at the 9th hour, with 2 intelligence officers and a leather document case that looked like it had been carried across a great many hard miles. The Silver Dominion guard at the door checked him with the same unhurried thoroughness she'd applied to everyone else that evening, and he stood for it without a word, which told Seraphine, watching from the corridor junction, something about how he was managing tonight. She let Callum receive him at the door and bring him through. She was already at the council table when he walked in, documents spread in the order she'd organized them that afternoon. Her 3 senior advisors arranged with the specific deliberateness of people who had been briefed on exactly what this meeting was and was not. Darius set his case on the table. His 2 officers stood back near the wall. He looked at the spread of Dominion documentation and was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man reading a room and understanding it accurately. "Start with the Pact's Eastern operations," he said. Not a request. A working suggestion from someone who had his own sequencing in mind and was checking it against hers. "Start with the archivist's testimony," she said. "Everything else builds from the forgery." He looked at her, nodded once. She placed the archivist's deposition at the center of the table. Darius read it standing, both hands flat on the table, and she watched him read it the way she watched everything. Not for reaction, but for what the absence of performed reaction revealed. His jaw was set, his breathing was controlled. When he reached the section that described the specific instructions the archivist had received, and the name of the noble house that had delivered them, something moved through his face that he contained before it surfaced fully. He straightened. Harwick. House Harwick authored the document. House Caldwell provided the ceremonial access for its presentation. She kept her voice level. Both are in the pact. Harwick has been my senior archival advisor for 12 years. Yes. He looked at her. The weight behind it was specific. Not asking for sympathy, not performing devastation, just the unguarded look of a man absorbing the particular quality of a betrayal that had been intimate enough to require trust first. 12 years? I know. She held his gaze. That's what makes it useful to them. A stranger in your archives doesn't produce a document with the correct ceremonial sealing. Someone who has had 12 years of access does. He pulled his own case open, placed his intelligence files beside hers with the methodical precision of a man who had already gone through the grief of it and was now operating in the space past that. My counterintelligence operation confirmed Harwick 3 weeks ago. I haven't moved on him because I needed to understand the full network before I pulled any one thread. He looked at the Dominion documentation. How many of the 7 houses have Eastern operations? 5. The other 2 are focused on the border kingdom entry points. She turned to the relevant section. They've been running supply interference in the Eastern territories for 2 years, posturing it as trade disruption, attributing it to the independent clans. 3 of those disruptions were directed at Silver Dominion member territories. A pause. They were testing your response capacity. Yes, and learning my supply routes. She looked at him directly. They knew the Silver Dominion would be invited to this summit. They needed to know how quickly I could mobilize and what my defensive gaps were. The room was very quiet. Voss was watching Darius with the assessment of someone who had spent 6 years learning to tell the difference between people performing credibility and people who simply had it. Darius's intelligence officers were watching Seraphine with the same calibrated attention. They worked through the night. Not together, exactly. Side by side was more accurate. 2 parallel intelligence operations being laid against each other and cross-referenced with the particular friction of people who had different organizational logic and different sourcing, and were finding, as the hours moved, that the gaps in one set of documentation were filled almost exactly by the other. Seraphine had the Eastern Pact operations in exhaustive detail, and the archivist's testimony as the foundational piece. Darius had the internal court chronology, the communication intercepts from inside Thornvale's own administrative structure, and the financial trail that connected the 7 houses to the border kingdom arrangements. Together, they had a complete picture. Separately, either case had gaps that a skilled advocate could exploit. By the second hour of the morning, they had a presentation sequence that would take 40 minutes in formal session and leave the pact with no viable response. She had constructed the sequencing. He had reviewed it without ego, flagged 2 ordering problems she'd agreed with, and they had revised it together in the flat collaborative register of people who were both good at this and had temporarily set aside everything else in service of the task. She noted without dwelling on it that working with him was efficient. The particular efficiency of 2 minds that operated at similar speed and didn't waste time on performance. She set that observation aside in the same internal storage she kept, other things she couldn't afford to examine during operational hours. At the 3rd hour, Callum refilled the water. Voss had fallen asleep upright in her chair in the corner, which was a skill she had apparently developed at some point in her 60-something years, and which Seraphine found inexplicably steadying. Darius was reviewing the final presentation sequence when he said, without looking up, "You knew about the Harwick connection before tonight. It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation." Garrett's intelligence pointed to a senior court archivist. "I didn't have the name confirmed until you said it." She looked at him. "If I'd had the name, I would have told you tonight regardless." "I know." He turned the page. "I wasn't asking if you'd held it back. I was asking when you knew the shape of it." 4 months ago. She turned back to her own documents. "When I understood that the pact had Eastern operations, and that those operations required inside knowledge of your administrative structure, the archivist's position was the logical access point. A forgery of that quality comes from inside, not outside." He was quiet for a moment. 4 months ago, you were already building toward this summit." "I'm always building toward something." She didn't look up. "That's not specific to you." He said nothing. Turned another page. At the 4th hour, she called the session closed and told him to get 2 hours of sleep before the morning session. He looked at her with the slight arrested quality of a man who had expected something else, argument, or continuation, or possibly the opening of a different kind of conversation. And then he nodded and gathered his documentation and left with his officers. She sat at the table after he was gone and looked at the combined presentation spread across the surface and held for exactly 2 minutes the full weight of what had just happened in this room. Not the operational content of it, the fact of it, that she had sat at a table for 4 hours with the man who had refused her bond in front of every alpha in the realm, and she had worked, and she had held, and she had been exactly who she had built herself to be, and it had neither broken anything nor restored anything, and that was the correct outcome. She went to bed. She slept for 90 minutes. She got up and dressed in the Silver Dominion's formal colors, gray and silver, clean lines, the iron seal at her collar. She was ready before anyone knocked. The second session of the summit opened with the border crisis proposals continuing from the prior morning. Seraphine sat through 40 minutes of it and watched the pact-adjacent delegates managing the discussion with the smooth, practiced efficiency of people who had been doing this for years, steering resolution away from any concrete agreement while creating the appearance of engaged deliberation. She watched Darius across the table. He was watching the same dynamic she was watching. Their eyes met once, briefly. Nothing passed between them that the room could read. At the 50-minute mark, the convener opened the floor for new business. Seraphine said, "The Silver Dominion requests time to present materials relevant to the summit's stated purpose." The convener acknowledged her. She stood. She presented for 38 minutes. She had done it in her head 4 times the night before and once at dawn, and she delivered it without notes, without inflection, without the particular emotional register that could be characterized as personal grievance. She presented the PAC's Eastern operations first, the supply interference, the disruption campaigns, the documented financial connections. She presented the border kingdom arrangements. She presented the internal court communications that Darius's intelligence operation had intercepted, introducing each piece in the sequence they had built together, handing to Darius at the points where his documentation was the source material, and he picked it up without a seam. It was, she noted in the back of her operational mind, the most functional 38 minutes of joint presentation she had ever participated in. At the 20-minute mark, she placed the archivist's testimony on the table. She read the central section into the record in full. She named House Harwick. She named House Caldwell. She named the 5 additional houses in the PAC's documented structure. The room was very quiet. At the 26-minute mark, she said, "The conspiracy's first documented operational act was the production of a forged prophecy, presented at the Sacred Moonrite 7 years ago, used to manipulate the Alpha King's bond rejection and destabilize the Ashcroft bloodline's claim to the throne. The document was produced under coercion by the Royal Archivist under direction from House Harwick." She looked at the assembled delegates. "I know this because I am the woman that document was used against. My name is Seraphine Ashcroft. I am Queen of the Silver Dominion, and I am alive because the attack that followed the right failed to kill me." The silence that followed had a specific quality. The silence of 30 alpha leaders absorbing something that restructured the entire 7-year political record simultaneously. Across the table, she saw Darius's hands go very still on the surface. She did not look at his face. She continued. At the 38th minute, she concluded. She sat down. The room erupted. Not chaos. Controlled eruption, the specific noise of powerful people processing information that rearranged their strategic positions while simultaneously trying not to show how much it had rearranged them. The Western Alpha Lord, a pragmatic man named Hartley, who had always operated closest to the political center, was on his feet demanding the archivist's testimony be submitted for independent verification. The Northeastern Territory's representative was speaking directly to one of the now-named PACT delegates, who had gone the color of old ash. The PACT-adjacent advisor to Darius's left, the one Seraphine had identified on her first corridor walk, pushed back from the table. He said something to the delegate beside him, too low for the room to hear. Seraphine heard it. She was close enough and the room was loud enough that no one was watching her specific level of attention. He said, "Tell Harwick the Eastern Wing, tonight." She did not look at him. She turned to Callum on her left and said very quietly, "Get Garrett. Tell him the Eastern Wing tonight is a pact action. He needs the corridor structure covered in the next 2 hours." Callum was gone from the room in 40 seconds. The convener was calling order. The session was devolving into the structured chaos of a formal proceeding that had received more information than its procedural framework could contain. 3 delegates were demanding immediate investigation. 2 of the named PACT representatives were attempting to speak simultaneously, their advocacy colliding into incoherence. The convener was banging the formal gavel with increasing urgency. Darius stood. The room quieted. Not entirely, but enough. The particular quiet that happened when the Alpha King of the largest territory in the realm stood up and used the specific register of a man who had not raised his voice in years because he hadn't needed to. "The testimony will be submitted for verification," he said. "The named houses will be placed under immediate investigation hold, effective from this session. No delegate under investigation designation leaves Meridian Crossing until the initial verification is complete." He looked at the PACT-adjacent advisor to his left. including members of my own delegation. The advisor's expression did not change. That told her something. A man who received that statement and felt it as the threat it was would have reacted, even minimally. The absence of reaction meant he had already moved past the session's outcome and into the contingency. She was on her feet before Darius finished his next sentence. She crossed to Voss and said, "Get everyone in the eastern wing, now. Do not wait for me." Voss was moving before she finished. She went to Darius. He was still managing the room, and she came to his right side and said, low and direct, "The contingency is tonight. The eastern wing. They have people already in position." He turned to look at her. The session noise was still running behind them. His eyes were sharp and present, and the particular quality of a man who had spent 9 years holding a throne by being very fast at deciding what the situation actually required. "How long do we have?" 2 hours. Possibly less if they think the session moved faster than their timeline. "My security lead is compromised at placement level. 3 positions." She held his gaze. "I have Garrett running my people into the corridor structure now, but I need your actual security lead, not the one in the room, the one you trust." He looked at her for 1 second. "Weston, Eastern Corridor, 2nd floor. He's been running independent since I identified the placement issue." "Get him to Garrett." He was already signaling. She turned and moved for the door, and behind her the session was still technically in progress, the convener still calling for order, the extraordinary procedural machinery of a formal summit trying to contain what had just been detonated inside it. She was 3 steps into the outer corridor when the lights in the eastern wing went out. Not a gradual failure. Simultaneous. Every torch, every lamp, every lit surface in the eastern residential corridor dropping to black in the space of a breath. Emergency contingency. Coordinated, prepared, the specific infrastructure of an operation that had rehearsed this. She stopped. Let her eyes adjust. The deep-set windows gave gray ambient light from the overcast afternoon outside, enough to see the corridor's basic shape, not enough to read faces. She heard movement to her left. Professional movement, controlled, heel-toe, the specific cadence of someone trained to move quietly in reduced visibility. She pressed against the wall and held absolutely still. 3 figures passed her position at 6 feet. Packed operatives, not meridian crossing security. Wrong posture, wrong equipment. Configuration for building security, the specific load-bearing quality of people carrying something that wasn't standard issue. They were moving toward the eastern wing's main suite, her rooms. She waited until they passed. Then she moved the opposite direction, toward the access stairs, the position where Garrett would be staging his people if he'd received her message. Her heart was running faster now, not with fear exactly, but with the specific biochemistry of high-stakes operational pressure, the thing that sharpened rather than compromised if you'd spent enough years letting it work for you instead of against you. She took the access stairs 2 at a time and came out on the 2nd floor to find Garrett already there with 4 of her people and a man she didn't recognize, but who carried himself with the precise controlled quality of someone who had been running independent intelligence operations in a hostile building. "Weston," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He didn't waste a second on surprise. Alpha King sent the contact signal. "I have 3 of mine on the north junction and 2 on the east access. 3 packed operatives passed my position in the main corridor, moving toward the eastern wing suite. They weren't there for documents." She looked at Garrett. "The archivist." Garrett's face changed. "He's in the secondary room on the east wing's ground floor." She was already moving back toward the stairs. The secondary room's door was locked from the outside. That was wrong. She had not locked it, and the archivist had not been given a lock, because they'd agreed that the door would remain accessible for exactly this kind of contingency. Locked from the outside meant someone had been ahead of her. Garrett had the lock off in 40 seconds with a tool she didn't ask him to explain. The room was empty. Not vacant. Disturbed. The chair was displaced from the table. The archivist's documents, which he had organized with the obsessive, careful neatness of a man who had been living with guilt long enough to ritualize everything around him, were scattered. His traveling bag was still on the bed. He hadn't left. He'd been taken. She stood in the middle of the disturbed room and ran the timeline. The session had ended, or effectively ended, roughly 20 minutes ago. The lights had gone out 4 minutes after she'd left. The archivist had been taken in that window, which meant the pact had moved on him before the lights, before the distraction, while the session was still in formal progress and her attention was divided. They had anticipated the testimony. They had anticipated the investigation designation. What they had not been able to prevent was the public presentation already entered into the summit's formal record, but they were trying to prevent the verification. Without the archivist's in-person testimony, the deposition was a document. A document could be challenged, questioned, attributed to fabrication. A living witness was something else entirely. She turned to Weston. North exit? Covered. East access? Covered. How many positions does the building have that aren't covered? A beat. The service access on the south face. It connects to the outer yard and the stable block. She looked at Garrett. He looked back at her with the expression he'd worn on a dark road 7 years ago. Not asking, already moving. South face, she said. Both of you, now. They went. She followed them into the corridor and stopped at the junction when she felt, before she heard, the specific vibration of someone behind her moving fast and without noise. She turned. Darius was there. No advisors. One hand on the wall at the corridor junction, breathing controlled but elevated, his formal dress disheveled at the collar, in a way that suggested the session room had not been entirely calm after she'd left. He read the situation in her face in approximately 1 second. They took him, she said. South face, he said. Not a question. Already going. He fell in beside her and they moved through the darkened corridor together at the particular pace of two people who had both decided that the only acceptable outcome was ahead of them and everything else was going to have to wait. She did not think about the irony of it. A dark corridor, 7 years from another dark road, and the man who had been the reason for that road running beside her now, with the specific quality of someone who understood, completely and without any remaining ambiguity, exactly what he owed her and exactly how insufficient any payment was going to be. She ran. He ran beside her, and in the south face service access, the pact operatives had 30 seconds on them, and an archivist who held the only living verification of everything she had built 7 years to prove, and a route to the stable block that led to horses and an open road and the permanent destruction of the one piece of testimony that could anchor the entire case. 30 seconds. She was going to need every one of them. The south face service access was a stone throat. Narrow, low-ceilinged, the kind of passage that existed in old buildings because the people who built them understood that supply lines and escape routes were the same infrastructure viewed from different directions. Seraphine and Darius hit it at a full run. Garrett 10 feet ahead with Weston flanking, and the darkness here was total. No windows, no ambient light from the overcast sky outside. Just the rough texture of old stone walls close enough on both sides that her knuckles grazed the right one when the passage turned. She ran by sound and memory. She had walked this passage on her first morning, the way she walked every passage in any building she intended to operate in, and her feet found the turn and the step down in the drain grate by the accumulated intelligence of a body that had been paying that kind of attention for 7 years. Ahead of her, Garrett's footsteps changed pitch. The specific acoustic shift of a passage opening into a larger space. The outer yard. She came through the access door into gray afternoon light and stopped moving with the controlled deceleration of someone who had learned that running into open space without reading it first was how you became the problem instead of solving it. The outer yard was maybe 40 feet across. Cobblestone. 3 cart bays on the left, the stable block straight ahead, a secondary supply access in the far right corner that she hadn't walked but that Weston had said connected to the road. 2 packed operatives were visible, one at the stable block entrance, one moving across the yard toward the supply access with something over his shoulder. Something that was moving. The archivist. Conscious, from the way his body was working against the operative's grip. Not dead weight, active resistance. The specific struggle of an older man who understood that compliance was not going to improve his situation. Garrett was already moving. Weston went left toward the stable block operative without being directed. The coordinated efficiency of someone who had spent years running operations without requiring instruction at every step. Seraphine went straight. She covered the yard in the time it took the operative carrying the archivist to register that the access door had opened and that what had come through it was not a retreating situation. He turned. He dropped one hand from the archivist to reach for the weapon at his side, and that was his error. The archivist, feeling the grip loosen, threw his entire body weight sideways, and the operative had to choose between controlling him and drawing, and he couldn't do both. And Seraphine was already inside his reach before he resolved the choice. She took him down with the economical efficiency of someone who had learned close-quarters pressure as a survival skill rather than a formal discipline. Not elegant, nothing that looked like training, just the direct application of momentum and leverage to the specific problem of a man who outweighed her by 60 pounds, but had both hands occupied. They hit the cobblestones together. He was stronger. She was faster and angrier and had 400 pounds of institutional grievance behind every decision she made, which turned out to be its own kind of weight. He got one hand free. She controlled the arm. He rolled. She moved with it. Behind her she heard Garrett's voice and the sound of a second struggle and the specific percussion of someone hitting stone at velocity. The operative under her found enough leverage to push. She went with it instead of fighting it, let herself roll off and came up on her feet 2 feet from him with the cobblestones hard under her palms from catching herself, and she looked across the yard and made a fast accounting of the situation. Garrett had his man down. Weston was at the stable block entrance in a standoff with the operative there, neither of them having moved to commit in the 2 seconds since she'd come up. The archivist was on the ground 6 feet from her, sitting up, breathing hard, one hand pressed to his left temple where he'd connected with the cobblestone during the fall. He was conscious. His eyes were tracking. The operative in front of her came up from the ground with a knife she hadn't seen him draw. Darius hit him from the right side with the full weight of a man who had been carrying everything he should have done 7 years ago and had just found something concrete to do with it. The operative went down hard and stayed there. Silence. The specific post-operational silence of a space that had been full of violent motion 30 seconds ago and was now just a yard with bodies on the ground and people breathing too fast. Seraphine crossed to the archivist, crouched beside him. "Can you stand?" He looked at her. His eyes were wet. Not from the hit, or not only from the hit. The expression of a man who had spent 7 years carrying a specific weight and had just been physically removed from the place where he'd been prepared to finally set it down. "Yes," he said. His voice was steadier than his hands. She helped him up, held his arm for the 3 seconds it took him to find his balance. Then she turned. Darius was standing over the downed operative. His breathing was elevated, his collar fully open now, and there was blood on his right hand from the cobblestones. Not a serious wound, the kind of scraping impact that happened when you hit stone at speed and used your hands to control the landing. He was looking at the archivist with the expression of a man who had read the testimony in a document and was now looking at the human being who had lived inside it for 7 years. "Can he testify today?" he said, directly to her because he understood she was the one who would know. "He can testify right now," the archivist said. Thin voice, definite voice. The particular quality of someone who had decided something and was not going to be talked out of it by any consideration, including the blood on his own temple. "I didn't come here to be protected. I came here to be heard." Darius looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once. The specific nod of a man who recognized a form of resolve he respected even when he had no right to claim a stake in it. "Then we go back in," he said. They went back in. The session room was not, when they returned, in the controlled state it had been an hour ago. The formal summit structure had fractured along the exact lines Seraphine had predicted it would fracture when the named PAC delegates understood that the investigation designation was real and that Darius had the authority and the intent to enforce it. 2 of the 7 named delegates had attempted to invoke procedural challenges to their designation. The convener had denied both on the grounds that the evidential presentation had been entered into formal record and investigation protocols were automatic. The 3rd named delegate, House Caldwell's representative, a man she recognized from the right 7 years ago as one of the witnesses who had watched her walk away from the ceremonial oval, had requested a recess for legal consultation and been denied. When Seraphine walked back through the session room door, With the archivist beside her and Darius 2 steps behind, the room's noise dropped out like a light going off. She walked to the center position at the main table. She did not sit. She looked at the convener. The Silver Dominion requests that the archivist's in-person testimony be entered into the formal record before this session concludes. The convener, who had the expression of a man who had presided over 30 summits and had never in any of them seen an afternoon like this one, said, "Granted." She stepped aside. The archivist walked forward on legs that shook slightly and held at the same time, the particular gait of someone who had been living in fear for 7 years and was using the last of it as fuel. He stood at the center position, looked at the assembled delegates, and began to speak. He spoke for 14 minutes. He named the names. He described the process. He described the specific coercive pressure that had been applied to him and the nature of the threat that had kept him silent for 7 years, and the specific night, 6 months ago, when he had made the decision that silence was no longer a bearable position. He described the forgery in technical detail, the ceremonial seal, the archival dating protocol, the specific language that had been dictated to him by House Harwick's direct representative. He described a young woman from the Ashcroft bloodline who had stood at a ceremonial position 3 feet from a platform she would never stand on, and what had been done to her in that room, and what had been done to her on the road afterward, and the 7 years he had spent knowing both things. When he finished, the room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet, when the thing that has been said cannot be unsaid, and everyone present is trying to organize themselves around the new shape of the record. The Caldwell representative stood. He opened his mouth. Seraphine said without raising her voice, "Sit down." He sat. She didn't examine why. She suspected it had something to do with the specific quality of her voice at that moment. Not angry, not cold, simply the register of someone who had run out of patience for the performance of innocence and had enough documentation in front of her to make that patience irrelevant. What happened next happened in the structured, procedural, absolutely brutal language of formal accountability, which was, she had always believed, the most devastating dialect available to anyone who had been wronged by an institution. The investigation designations were confirmed. The Border Kingdom arrangement was entered into the War Powers Record, which gave Darius the formal authority to treat the external threat as an act of coordinated aggression rather than independent action. The Silver Dominion's documentation of the Eastern operations was accepted as primary evidence. And then the convener asked, into the record, whether the Alpha King of Thornvale wished to formally address the testimony regarding the Sacred Moon Rite and the events of 7 years prior. Darius stood. She watched him from across the table. He had blood dried on his right hand and his collar was still open, and there was a cut on his jaw from somewhere in the corridor that she hadn't seen happen, and he stood at the head of the table with 30 Alpha leaders watching him, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had made a catastrophic error and was choosing not to perform contrition but to enact it, which was a different thing and considerably harder. The rite 7 years ago was corrupted by forged evidence introduced by members of my own court, he said. I acted on that evidence without adequate verification. I performed a formal rejection of a fated bond on the basis of a document I should have investigated more thoroughly, in front of every Alpha leader in this realm. And I did not question it because I trusted the source, and because the clause gave me a procedural mechanism that I used without interrogating my own certainty. He paused. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the record, the formal record, the summit's documentation, the thing that would outlast this room. Lady Seraphine Ashcroft was wronged by this kingdom, by its court and by its king. The subsequent attack on her convoy was a pact action, and the 7 years of false declaration of her death is a consequence of this kingdom's failure to investigate that attack adequately. Another pause. I am placing this statement into the formal record. Whatever formal acknowledgement is required beyond this session, the Thornvale throne will provide it. He sat down. She had prepared herself for this moment. She had prepared for the words, for the formal shape of it, for the weight of hearing her own name used in that specific context in that specific room. She had been thorough, and she had been practical, and she had approached it with the same systematic preparation she applied to every other element of the summit. She had not prepared for the particular way her chest handled it when it actually happened. Not breaking. Nothing broke. She was past the breaking point of that particular thing. Something else. The specific sensation of a weight that had been built into the structure of her body for 7 years being formally acknowledged as having existed, and the disorientation of that. Not relief, not grief. Something in the space between them that didn't have a clean name. She breathed through it. She did not look away from the table in front of her. She let it move through and settle and become part of the archive of things she had survived. The formal session recessed. The investigation protocols began. PAC delegates were separated from the general population of the summit under investigation designation. Darius's security lead, Weston, the one she'd trusted, took operational command of building security with a directness that made clear he'd been waiting for the authorization. She walked outside into the outer courtyard, the main one, not the service yard with its cobblestones and operational residue, and stood in the cold late afternoon air and breathed. The sky had cleared somewhat from the overcast of the morning. The stone of the Meridian Crossing building behind her was old and solid, the kind of construction that had survived more than one kind of war. She heard him before he came around the corner. The specific quality of his step, which she had identified on the corridor walk that morning and apparently stored without deciding to. She did not turn. He stopped 10 feet from her. She could hear him breathing, still elevated from the yard or from the session or from the accumulated pressure of an afternoon that had required a great deal of a man who was running his own internal reckoning simultaneously with the political one. He said, "The investigation will take 3 weeks minimum. The Border Kingdom arrangements need a coordinated response, and the timing requires that the Silver Dominion's standing forces be factored into the defensive alignment." He said it to the back of her head, in the register of a man who was starting with the operational, because the operational was something he was allowed to address. "I need to know if you're willing to coordinate on that." "Yes," she said, "on the same terms as tonight. Strategic cooperation, defined scope." "Agreed." A pause. The particular weight of a pause that was not about the Border Kingdoms. "Seraphine." "Don't," she said. Not hard, not cold. The quiet, steady voice of a woman who knew exactly what was coming and had decided on its shape before it arrived. She turned to face him. "Whatever you're going to say, I've already said most of it to myself. In better language, with more time to organize it. I've had 7 years." He held her gaze. The cut on his jaw was small, she could see now. The blood on his hand had dried dark against his knuckles. He looked like a man who had been through an afternoon that had required everything and was now standing in a courtyard trying to find the words for a different kind of debt. "I know," he said. "I know you have." He looked at her with the specific expression she had seen once in a corridor last night and had filed without dwelling on, not hope, not plea, something rawer than either. "I'm not asking for anything. I want you to know that. I'm not standing here to ask you for anything. I know you're not." She did know. She had assessed it accurately from the moment in the corridor when he'd said, "Let me be useful and not let me make this right," because he'd understood the distinction. That's not the problem. What's the problem? She looked at him for a long moment. The cold air moved between them. Somewhere in the building behind her, the investigation protocols were being initiated and the realm was being reorganized around the new shape of the record. And all of it was the direct consequence of 7 years of work that she had done because he had rejected her on a cold stone oval and she had decided not to let it be the end of her story. "The problem," she said quietly, "is that you're not the man who hurt me anymore. And I'm not the woman who was hurt." She held his gaze without softening it. "I can work with who you are now. I've been doing it for 2 days. But I cannot give you what you're standing in that courtyard trying not to ask for. Because what you're trying not to ask for belongs to someone who doesn't exist anymore." She was 23 years old, and she had a plain bone clasp in her hair, and she thought a bond meant something permanent. A beat. She was right about that. She was just wrong about which thing it would make permanent. He was very still. "I'm sorry," he said. The third time he'd said it in 2 days, and this time it had a different quality. Not an apology directed at the formal record, not the managed contrition of a man in a session room, just the word. in the specific voice of someone who understood that it couldn't carry the weight of what it was being asked to carry and was saying it anyway because there was nothing else left. She nodded. She didn't tell him it was fine, because it wasn't, and they both knew it, and she had stopped being in the business of managing other people's comfort around the truth a long time ago. She didn't tell him it was unforgivable, because it wasn't that either. She had moved past that position in year 4, when she'd understood that carrying active unforgiveness required more structural energy than she was willing to allocate to it. She said, "The border coordination meeting is at dawn. Bring Weston and your intelligence lead." She held his gaze for one more second, honest, clear, the look of someone who had told the truth and intended to keep doing so. "Get some sleep, Darius." She turned and walked back toward the building. He stood in the courtyard and watched her go, and the cold air moved through the space between them, and somewhere in his chest the specific weight of understanding settled permanently into the position it was going to occupy for the rest of his reign. Not grief exactly, not rage. The clean, hard, specific weight of a consequence that had been earned and that he was not going to ask anyone to help him carry. She walked through the main entrance door. She did not look back. Inside, Voss was waiting in the first corridor with the expression she wore when she had been monitoring a situation and had formed conclusions she was prepared to share. "The archivist's testimony has been formally logged," Voss said. "Investigation holds confirmed on all 7 houses. The convener has requested a full assembly for tomorrow morning to address the Border Kingdom response." "Good." "The Thornvale delegation has requested Silver Dominion coordination on the defensive alignment." "I know. Dawn meeting." Seraphine moved down the corridor toward the eastern wing. "How is the archivist?" "Resting. The cut on his temple needed attention. He's been asking to speak with you when you have a moment." Voss walked beside her. "He wants to know what happens next." "He testifies at the investigation proceedings. His cooperation will be entered into the formal protection record." She reached the eastern wing door. "He gets to set it down. That's what happens next." Voss was quiet for a moment. "And you?" She put her hand on the door. Outside, somewhere on the far side of the building, the last light of the afternoon was going down over the eastern territories, over the 43 clans and the 11,000 standing forces, and the grain fields and the council chambers, and everything she had built in the years that had been supposed to end her. "I have a border war to coordinate," she said, "and a realm to stabilize." She opened the door. "Same as always." She walked through, but in the main session room, which had emptied of delegates but not of consequence, the formal record was still open on the convener's table, and on its latest page in the official notations was a line that had not existed anywhere in any document for 7 years. "Seraphine Ashcroft, living, present, Queen of the Silver Dominion, testimony entered and verified." And 2 floors above, in the rooms assigned to the named packed houses now under investigation hold, House Harwick's senior representative was not sleeping and was not complying, and had, in the 40 minutes since the investigation designation had been enforced, been in contact with someone outside the building through a method that Weston's sweep had not yet identified. And that contact had just sent back a single word. He had Seraphine's door in 90 seconds. She was already awake. She opened the door in her working clothes. She had not changed, had not slept, had been at her desk with the border coordination documents and the investigation sequencing and the specific focused industry of a woman who had learned that the hours between midnight and dawn were either your most productive or your most vulnerable, and she intended them to be the former. She read Weston's face before he spoke. "How long?" she said. "We intercepted 40 minutes ago. The transmission origin was inside the building. Northern residential block, 2nd floor, Harwick's rooms. He has a contact outside." "Had. I've closed the external access points in the last 30 minutes. Weston held her gaze, but 40 minutes is enough time to have moved people into position if they were already staged. She pulled on her outer jacket. "Where's Garrett?" "Eastern Corridor Junction." "Darius?" A half-second pause. "I went to him first. He's already mobilized." She noted that without comment. Filed the specific quality of what it meant that Weston had gone to Darius first. Not disloyalty. Something more complicated. The instinct of a security professional who had assessed the threat and made a judgment about command structure that she couldn't argue with on operational grounds. "Then let's go," she said. The building at the third hour had the particular quality of a space that was simultaneously asleep and not the formal summit population in their residential wings, the investigation-designated delegates under guard, the building's own night staff moving through their routines. The PAC's operational window was this specific overlap: enough people asleep to reduce witness exposure, enough building activity to cover movement noise. She moved through the main corridor with Weston flanking and found Darius at the eastern junction with Garrett and 4 of the Thornvale security personnel who had passed Weston's vetting. He was in dark working clothes, no formal dress, the scar on his neck fully visible above the open collar. He looked at her when she came around the corner, and the look was operational, reading her status, her readiness, and then passed her to Weston. "Northern Block confirmed?" he said. "Harwick is the origin point," Weston said, "but the action won't come from his rooms. He's the signal, not the executor." "Where's the execution coming from?" Seraphine said. "The archivist." Both men looked at her. "They failed this afternoon," she said. "The testimony is in the formal record. The investigation hold is enforced. The one remaining variable that could be used to challenge the record's credibility is the archivist himself. A living witness can be cross-examined, discredited, pressured to recant in ways a filed deposition cannot." She looked at Darius. "They're not coming for the documents. They're coming for him." Darius said, "Where is he?" "Secondary room, eastern wing, ground floor. Same room as this afternoon." She looked at Garrett. "Who's on his door?" "2 of mine," Garrett said. "But if the PAC staged people before Weston closed the external access, then they're already inside the building." She turned. "Eastern wing, now." They moved at the particular pace of people who had agreed that controlled speed was better than running, because running told every person you passed that something was wrong, and the wrong person noticing that at the wrong moment was its own operational liability. She led. She knew the building's geography better than anyone present except Weston, and Weston was managing the communication intercepts on the move, which meant she was navigating. She took the interior route, the service passage on the west side of the building that ran parallel to the main corridor and connected to the eastern wing's ground floor through the supply access she had walked on her first morning. The supply access door was ajar. She had closed it herself that morning. She remembered it specifically. A heavy door, iron latch, the slight resistance of old hinges that needed attention. She had closed it and heard it seat. She put her hand up. The group stopped. She looked at the gap in the door. 2 inches, enough to see that the eastern wing ground floor corridor beyond it was dark. It had not been dark when she walked it 3 hours ago. The night lamps were on a continuous burn cycle. Someone had extinguished them. She looked back at Darius. He had read the same information from the same evidence. He moved up beside her without being directed, and they were, briefly, shoulder to shoulder in the narrow service passage with the gap of the door and the dark corridor beyond it, and she felt the particular physical reality of that proximity. Not the bond, that old signal had been quiet for years, but simply the fact of him, the solid, specific presence of a man who was not standing behind her but beside her and had not needed to be asked. She pushed the door open and went through. The eastern wing ground floor resolved out of the dark in the ambient light from the single window at the far end. Shapes, not details. The corridor was maybe 30 feet long, 4 doors. The archivist's room was the second on the right. The door was open. She moved to it, looked in. The room was occupied. 1 figure on the floor, one of Garrett's guards, down, breathing from the sound of it, not dead. 1 figure standing over the bed. 1 figure on the bed that was the archivist, sitting up, pressing himself into the corner between the bed and the wall, with the focused intensity of someone who has reduced their available space to the minimum and is prepared to defend it. The standing figure heard her in the doorway, turned. House Harwick's senior representative was not, as she had expected, one of the operatives from the afternoon. He was the delegate himself, 50s, silver-haired, the formal bearing of a man who had spent 30 years in court politics and had learned to wear authority the way other people wore skin. He held a document in one hand and something small and dark in the other that caught the ambient window light with the specific quality of something that had an edge. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been caught and had decided that being caught was not the same as being finished. Queen Vance, he said. The title was a performance, the specific use of the diminished name to establish a positioning she was not going to accept. Harwick, she said. This doesn't have to be what it looks like. What does it look like? He held her gaze. A man retrieving his property from someone who was coerced into taking it. She was very still. Behind her, she could feel the presence of Darius and Garrett and Weston filling the doorway, and she held up one hand without looking back. Not yet. Not yet. Because she understood, with the specific intelligence of someone who had spent 7 years learning the difference between a fight and a negotiation, that this room was a negotiation until the moment it stopped being one. The archivist is not your property, she said. The testimony is not your property. The document you produced under his name 7 years ago was not your property. It was a fabrication that you used to corrupt a formal ceremony and nearly kill a woman on a public road. She kept her voice level. You have nothing left to retrieve, Lord Harwick. Everything you built on that forgery has been entered into the formal record today. The only remaining question is whether you face the investigation proceedings tomorrow with the possibility of a negotiated accounting, or whether you face them with tonight added to the record as well. His jaw tightened. The investigation proceedings will be challenged. The archivist's testimony is verified and filed and in the hands of 30 alpha leaders who watched him deliver it in person. She took one step into the room. You cannot uncreate what happened today. No one in this building can. The only choice you have left is what tonight costs you on top of everything else. He looked at her, really looked at her. Not the assessment of a political opponent, something older and less managed than that. She watched him calculate. She had watched this specific calculation many times in 7 years. The moment when a person who has built their position on concealment confronts the arithmetic of exposure and tries to find a number that still works. There wasn't one. She could see the moment he understood that. His hand dropped to his side. The small dark object disappeared into his jacket pocket. He set the document on the bed beside the archivist with the specific, careful motion of a man trying to preserve 1 square inch of dignity in a room that had run out of it. I want the negotiated accounting on record, he said. His voice was flat. All the court performance had gone out of it. Then you'll have it, she said. Walk out of this room and present yourself to the investigation officers. Tonight. He walked out. He passed her at 6 inches without looking at her, and she let him pass, and Garrett was immediately behind him with the controlled attention of someone who was not going to let that accounting become hypothetical. She looked at the archivist. He was still in the corner of the bed. His hands were shaking, not from fear anymore, or not only, but from the specific physical response of someone whose body had been running on adrenaline for 14 hours and was beginning to understand that the immediate crisis had passed and was presenting the bill. His temple wound had been redressed at some point, and the bandage was still clean. He said, "Is it over?" She sat down on the edge of the bed. The question deserved a real answer, not a managed one. The part that required you to be in this room at 3 in the morning, yes, she said. The investigation will take weeks. The testimony proceedings will require you to be present and exact and prepared for cross-examination. That part is not over. She held his gaze. But you have done what you came here to do, and nothing Harwick was carrying in his pocket was going to change what's already in the record. He let out a breath. It was a long breath, the kind that had been stored under pressure for a very long time, and was only now finding the space to move. I've been afraid for 7 years, he said. Not a confession, a plain statement of fact, the specific honesty of a man who had finally moved to the other side of something. I know, she said. You should have been. What they asked you to do was wrong, and the people who asked you to do it were powerful, and fear in that situation isn't weakness, it's information. She looked at him steadily. What you did tonight by coming here, by testifying today, that is also information. He looked at her with the expression of someone trying to calibrate what he was being offered. I'm not in the business of deciding what people deserve, she said. I'm in the business of building things that work. What you did today made the record complete. That matters regardless of what you deserve. She stood. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. Not comfort performance, just the specific acknowledgement of one person to another that they had both been in a room and both survived it. Then she turned and walked to the door. Darius was in the corridor. The operational personnel had moved, Garrett with Harwick, Weston managing the secondary sweep, the Thornvale guards securing the eastern wing perimeter. The corridor was empty except for him, standing in the ambient dark with his back against the wall and the expression of a man who had just watched something happen that he had not been the one to resolve and had understood, for perhaps the first time with full clarity, what that meant about the difference between power and capacity. She walked out of the room and stopped 3 feet from him. "It's done," she said. "Yes." He looked past her toward the archivist's room, then back. "You didn't need me for that." "No, you haven't needed me for any of it." She looked at him. "That's not why I asked for the joint presentation." "I know." He held her gaze. "Why did you?" She considered giving him the operational answer. It carries more weight. It closes every exit. Both of those things were true. She had said them to him in the corridor 24 hours ago, and they had been accurate. "Because it was the right thing for the realm," she said, "and because you had done the work to earn it." She paused. "Both things can be true." He was quiet for a moment. The building around them was settling back into its night rhythms. Somewhere above them, the investigation officers were receiving Lord Harwick. Somewhere outside, the Border Kingdom threat was exactly what it had been before tonight, unresolved, requiring coordination. The work that needed doing was not done. It was barely started. "The border coordination meeting is at dawn," he said. "I know. I'll be there." He pushed off the wall. He stood in front of her in the dark corridor with the specific posture of a man who has said everything he has the right to say and understands that the next move is not his. "Get some sleep, Seraphine." She almost smiled. The particular echo of it, her own words from the courtyard, returned to her without performance, without a claim behind them. Just the same words offered back. "You too," she said. He walked away down the corridor. She watched him go. Not with longing, not with regret, with the specific clear-eyed quality of someone who was seeing a thing accurately and letting it be what it actually was. A man who had made a catastrophic error and was learning to carry it with his eyes open. A man who had spent an afternoon and a night proving that the capacity to change, to absorb a truth and reorganize around it was not lost to him. It wasn't enough. She had not built an empire on the currency of almost enough, but it was real. And real things, she had learned, deserved to be seen clearly, neither inflated into what you wanted them to be, nor diminished into what was easier to dismiss. She turned back to her rooms. The dawn meeting happened. It was long, operational, and productive in the specific way that sessions were productive when the people in the room had stopped performing and started working. The Border Kingdom response was structured across 3 phases. The Silver Dominion's Eastern Standing Forces were formally integrated into the first phase defensive alignment on terms she had negotiated in 40 minutes with the directness of someone who had 43 territories and 11,000 soldiers behind her, and no longer needed to be modest about either. Darius sat across the table from her for 4 hours, and they built a strategic framework that neither of them could have built alone. And that was the accurate and complete summary of what they were to each other now. 2 rulers who made each other more effective, separated by the specific, irreversible distance of 7 years and 1 cold stone oval and 2 words spoken in the formal dark. The investigation ran for 22 days. She stayed for 11 of them, handled the testimony proceedings, ensured the archivist's formal protection status was entered into the permanent record, and then she left. Not in the middle of the night, not without documentation or farewell. She submitted the Silver Dominion's formal withdrawal from the summit proceedings to the convener with full diplomatic notation, shook hands with the delegates who mattered, accepted Weston's brief and professional nod that functioned as a respectful acknowledgement from a man who did not waste words, and walked to the stable block in the early morning of the 12th day. Garrett was already there with the horses. Voss was at her stirrup when she mounted. The old woman looked up at her with the specific assessment that needed no particular expression to communicate itself. 6 years of reading had made the language mostly silent. "Home," Seraphine said. Voss mounted. They rode out through the eastern gate in the direction of the territories that had been built from nothing, and the road was cold and straight and entirely familiar in the way that the roads you have made your own become familiar. Not because they are easy, but because they are yours. She did not look back at the Meridian Crossing building. She had looked back on enough roads. The seasons turned. The investigation concluded with 7 houses dismantled, their territorial holdings redistributed through the formal accountability proceedings that she had structured before she left. The Border Kingdom action was resolved through the coordinated defense she had helped design. No full war, a contained confrontation that ended in a negotiated boundary agreement, enforced by both the Thornvale military and the Silver Dominion standing forces operating in the first joint defensive action in the realm's recorded history. She received the formal treaty document at the Silver Dominion's administrative seat in the early spring. Read it in her office with the morning light coming through the eastern window and the council yard busy below with the ordinary motion of a functioning sovereign state. The treaty listed 2 signatories in equal formal weight, the Silver Dominion and the Thornvale Empire. Her seal beside his, in the same font size, at the same position on the page. She signed it, sent it back with the diplomatic courier, went to the next document on her desk. There was always a next document. The formal recognition came 3 months after the treaty, not as a concession, as the natural conclusion of a political reality that had been true for 2 years and simply needed the institutional language to catch up to it. The Silver Dominion was formally recognized as a sovereign equal in the Eastern Realm. 43 territories. Full diplomatic standing. Her iron seal given the same archival weight as any gold one in the realm. She read the recognition document in the same office, at the same desk, with the same morning light. She set it down and sat for a long time looking out the eastern window at the grain fields in early summer green, at the council yard, at the things she had built. She thought about a 23-year-old girl with a plain bone clasp in her hair, standing on a cold stone oval. She thought about a burning road and an 11-minute mounting block, and the specific moment when she had decided that being declared dead was the most useful thing that had ever happened to her. She thought about the 6 years of tea and patience and hard conversation and the particular discipline of converting rage into architecture, grief into foundation, loss into the first stone of something that was going to last. She thought about what it cost, not the surface cost, the years, the work, the roads, and the cold rooms and the negotiations that ran until 3 in the morning, the deeper cost, the life she had not lived because she was building this one, the things that had been foreclosed by the particular path she had chosen. She held that cost without flinching, the way she held everything, directly, clearly, without the comfort of pretending it was smaller than it was. And then she set it down beside the recognition document and picked up the next file. Because that was the thing that the rejected girl on the cold stone oval could not have understood, and the queen at this desk had learned at the specific cost of everything, that the inventory of what you had paid was not the same as the measure of what you had built. The cost was real. The building was also real. Both things lived in the same body, the same history, the same woman at this desk on this morning, and the capacity to hold both without needing to resolve them into a simpler story was not resignation. It was what came after survival. It was what survival was actually for. In the Thornvale capital in the same season, Darius Thornvale sat in his private study with the recognition document in front of him and a fire burning in the grate that he was actually feeding this time. And he thought about a courtyard and a corridor and a woman who had told him the truth with such precision that it had taken 3 months to fully understand what she had given him by doing it. He had been building something too, in the months since Meridian Crossing. Not an empire. He already had one, battered but intact, its internal rot excised through the investigation and its borders stabilized through the treaty. Something quieter than that. The specific architecture of a man reconstructing his understanding of what he was and what he was capable of, now that the flattering version of both had been permanently retired. He had made a catastrophic error. He had made it in the most public way possible. He had lived with the consequences of it for 16 months of active reckoning and would live with them for the rest of his reign, and that was not a tragedy. It was the correct accounting, and he had learned to hold it as such. He had lost the only person who had ever looked at him without the filter of the throne. He had lost her not to death or distance, but to the specific irrevocable logic of actions and their consequences. And she had built an empire in the space of his failure, and that empire was stronger than anything he could have offered her. He understood why. He had sat with the understanding until it was no longer something he was trying to manage and became simply something he knew. He picked up the recognition document, looked at her seal beside his on the final page. The iron mark of a sovereignty that had been built on a road he should have protected, in territories he had never bothered to look at, by a woman he had publicly refused. He put the document in the formal archive, closed it. Then he went to his desk and began the work of the next day, and the day after, and all the days that a man had to fill when he had learned, at catastrophic cost, but learned, that the throne was not a reward but a responsibility, and that the most honest thing you could do with the life you had been given and misused was to use the remainder of it better. Years moved the way years moved in territories that were finally at peace, not fast, not slow, with the particular cadence of time that has room to be what it is because no one is spending every hour of it managing an active crisis. The Silver Dominion grew into what it had always been built to be, not the largest sovereignty in the realm, not the most militarily powerful, but the most reliably functional, the one that other territories came to when they needed a model for how to build something that would last. She expanded the council structure. She trained successors. She took on the particular work of the middle years of a reign, not construction anymore, but maintenance and transmission, the harder and less celebrated work of ensuring that what you had built could survive your absence. She was good at it. She had always been better at the work than at the recognition of the work, which was, she had decided, probably the correct arrangement. The joint diplomatic summits happened twice a year. She and Darius sat across tables from each other with the professional ease of two people who had built a working relationship on honest terms and maintained it with the same care they brought to everything else they maintained. They did not avoid each other. They did not perform warmth they did not have. They were, in the accurate language of what they actually were, effective colleagues and sovereign equals who had learned to see each other clearly and had found that what they saw was, in the ways that mattered, worthy of respect. That was not a small thing. She did not treat it as a small thing. She was 37 when the History Commission asked her to provide a formal account of the Silver Dominion's founding for the realm's consolidated historical record. She sat with the request for a week before she answered it. Then she sat with her archivist, her own, the one she had trained, not the old man who had retired to a quiet eastern village with his formal protection status and his freedom from a weight he had finally set down, and she dictated the account in the plain working language she used for everything that mattered. She started it at the beginning, the cold stone oval, the two words, the burning road. She did not make it smaller than it was. She did not make herself more heroic than she had been. She described a 23-year-old girl who had been publicly destroyed and had sat on a mounting block for 11 minutes, and then stood up, and what that standing up had required, and what it had built, and what it had cost, and what it had been for. She described the years of tea and patience, the archivist's testimony, the corridor at Meridian Crossing, the courtyard, and what had been said in it, and what had not been said and did not need to be. She described the empire she had built in the territories that no one had bothered to look at, and the 43 clans that had become something together that none of them had been able to be alone, and the iron seal that said queen because it was accurate and not because anyone had granted it. At the end, her archivist asked, "What do you want the record to say about why you stayed in the Eastern Territories after the road, when you could have found your way back to—" "I didn't stay because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "I stayed because the work was there and I was the right person to do it." She looked out the window. That's the honest answer. It was always the work. He wrote it down. The record was published the following year. It was read in 43 territories and in the Thornvale capital and in the border kingdoms that had been parties to the treaty and in every place that had been touched, directly or by consequence, by the empire that had been built in the forgotten East. It was read by a man in a private study with a fire in the grate. He read it in an evening, straight through, and he did not put it down once. When he finished, he sat for a long time in the particular silence of someone who has been told a true thing about themselves from the outside, and has had the integrity to hear it as true. He wrote her one letter. Not a diplomatic communication, a private letter, the kind that did not go through official channels but through a courier he trusted because he had chosen the man himself many years ago for exactly this kind of trust. It was short. It said that he had read the account, that the record was accurate, that he was glad she had written it. It said one other thing that he had never said in any corridor or courtyard or session room, that he had spent years finding the right words for and had eventually understood could not be improved by more words, that the realm was better because she had not let what he did be the end of her story. She read the letter at her desk, read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the same pocket where she had once kept a mother's letter and a bloodline paper and a forged death announcement. The pocket was empty now. She had long since moved those things to the formal archive where they belonged. But the space remained, and she put his letter there, and she sat for a moment with the weight of the whole long story in her hands. Then she set it down, picked up the next file, and went back to work. Outside the window, the Eastern Territories ran all the way to the sea. 43 clans and their children and their grain fields and their council chambers and everything that had been built in the years that were supposed to have been nothing, in the lands that no one had bothered to look at, by a woman who had learned that the most powerful thing in any empire was not the man who held the throne. It was the person who had been told they were nothing and had chosen deliberately and at great cost, and without any certainty of outcome, to build something anyway. History would call her the Queen Who Rose. She would have called it simpler than that. She had been given a destruction. She had made it into a foundation. Everything else was just the work.